Hello students, today's video is on factoring higher degree polynomials. We talked about factoring once before, but it was mainly when we had quadratics. So these polynomials are going to be higher degrees, so you're going to have higher degrees than just a quadratic. So the steps are still the same, so let's review those steps. The first thing you're going to do is you're going to create two groups by putting parentheses around the first two terms and the last two terms. Then you're going to factor out the GCF, which is the greatest common factor of each group. What happens twice, which is what's in parentheses, is a factor, and the other factor is what is not in parentheses. So let's go ahead and work through a few examples. This first example, we have 3x to the fourth minus 2x squared plus 15x squared minus 10. And so we're going to group together the first two terms with the last two terms. And when we do that, when we look at the first group, we want to factor out the GCF. And so the GCF of those two terms would be x squared. We don't have a coefficient in common. So when I divide by x squared, I would be left with 3x squared minus 2. In the second group, 15x squared minus 10, you can divide both of those by 5. So we're going to put plus 5 on the outside and go ahead and divide that. So we'd have 3x squared minus 2. Now when you get to this step, again, your parentheses should be the same. And so that represents your first factor. And what's on the outside is your second factor. And that would be how you factor that example. So let's look at the next one. We have 3x to the third plus 7x squared minus 6x minus 14. So again, group your first two and your last two. When I look at that first group, I can divide out an x squared, which would leave me with 3x plus 7 after I've divided by x squared. The second group, when you have that negative, you want to make sure that you divide out the negative as well. You always need to divide out that negative if there's a negative there. So then if I look at 6x minus 14, I can divide both of those by 2. So I'm going to be dividing that group by a negative 2. So negative 6x divided by negative 2 is 3x. Negative 14 divided by negative 2 is a positive 7. So again, our parentheses match. So that's our first factor. And then our second factor is what's on the outside. All right, let's look at another example. Let's look at C. So we have 2x to the third plus x squared minus 22x minus 11. So again, go ahead and group your first two and group your last two. In the first group, I can divide out an x squared. So that would leave you with 2x. X squared divided by x squared is 1, so you just put plus 1. Then in the second group, I do need to divide out that negative. And then 22x and 11 can be divided by 11. So I'm dividing it by a negative 11. So negative 22x divided by negative 11 is a positive 2x. Negative 11 divided by negative 11 is a positive 1. Parentheses match. That's our first factor. And our last factor would be x squared minus 11. Okay, you go ahead and pause the video and do this last example on your own. And when you're ready to check your answer, go ahead and start back. All right, so for this last example, you should have gotten 2x minus 1 times x squared minus 10. So check your work, and let's go ahead and move on to the next section. All right, so this part is going to be new for you. We have sum and difference of cubes. And so this is a special pattern that comes up sometimes. And so a sum of cubes, so you want to think of your cubes, your perfect cubes are 1, 8, 27, 64, 125, and so on. Because when you cube 1, so 1 to the third power is equal to 1. 2 to the third power is equal to 8. 3 to the third power is equal to 27. 4 to the third power is 64. 5 to the third power is 125, and so on. This would be 6 to the third. This would be 7 to the third, 8 to the third, 9 to the third, and 10 to the third. Now, if you ever are not sure whether or not it is a perfect cube, you can use the cube root, which is on your calculator. I believe it's under math, and I believe it's number 4, if I remember correctly. So you can always go to the cube root if that number is in fact a perfect cube. So if you have a sum of cubes, so let's look at that for a second. A sum of cubes is when you have something cubed plus something cubed. You're going to use this formula. So whatever your A is, you're going to do A plus B. So take your A and your B and just write it as one factor with a plus sign in between them. Then you're going to take your A and you're going to square it, and then do minus A times B, and then plus your B squared. And I want you to pay attention to how these signs are figured out. Whatever you start with, if you start with a plus, then in this first parenthesis, you're going to have a plus. If you start with a plus, in the second parenthesis, that second term is going to have a minus. It's going to be the opposite sign. And then that last b squared is always going to be positive, because anytime you square something, it's positive. Okay? Now, if we have a difference of cubes, so a difference means that we have a subtraction sign right there in the middle. So if you have something cubed minus something cubed, you're going to write your first factor as A minus B. So whatever your first cube was, the cube root of that, A would be your A. And then the second term, when you take the cube root of that, that's your B. So you do A minus B. Then you take your A and you square it. Then you do your A times B, and then you do your B and square it. So notice that this looks very similar to the formula for sum of cubes. The difference is just your signs. If you start with a minus, your first factor is going to have a minus. And then the second factor, the second term, is going to be the opposite sign. So since we started with a minus, we're going to put a positive. And then remember, this is always positive. So these are formulas that you're going to use. Now you do need to write down these formulas, and you need to get used to using them. So I'm going to show you how to work through these. So the first thing that you're going to do, if you think you have a sum or a difference of cubes, you're going to rewrite both terms as something cubed plus or minus something cubed. And remember, if you are struggling with that part, take the cube root. So go to your calculator and take the cube root of whatever is there. Then you're going to substitute into the formula and simplify it. All right, so let's work through this. All right, so for our first example, we have x to the third plus 125. Now, this has two terms. We notice that the first term has a cube, so this is kind of our clue that this might be a sum of cubes. So let's write down what cubed equals both of those terms. So x cubed is obviously x in parentheses cubed. 125. If you remember from the perfect cubes that we wrote before, 125 is a perfect cube. It's found by doing 5 cubed. Okay, so now what happens is what's in your parentheses represents your A, and the 5 is your B. So if I look at my formula here, I'm going to do A plus B. So my A was X, my B was 5, so X plus 5. Then you're going to take A and you're going to square it. So my A was X. When I square it, it becomes X squared. Then you're going to do minus, and it says to do A times B. Well, my A was X, my B was 5. If I do X times 5, that's going to be the same thing as 5X. And then you're going to do your B squared. My B was 5, so if I do 5 squared, that gives you 25. So plus 25. And then this is your factor. These are your factors, I guess I should say. Okay, so again, you're just plugging into that formula. All right, let's look at this next one. 216 x to the third minus 1. So when you see that x to the third and there's only 2 terms there, that's probably a clue that it might be a sum or difference of cubes. This is a difference of cubes because we have a minus. So 216 x to the third, how can I get that? By cubing something. Well, 216 was 6 cubed, and x cubed obviously is just x, so we're going to write that as 6x in parentheses cubed. Now 1 obviously is just going to be 1 cubed. All right, so 6x represents my A, and 1 is my B. Okay, so let's write that down. I'm going to put, this is my A, and this is my B. So if I look at the formula, I need to do A minus B, so that would just be 6x minus 1. Now, I have to do A squared, so that's going to be 6x squared. Well, 6x squared is 36x squared. Then I'm going to do A times B. That would be 6x times 1, which would just be 6x. And that's going to be a plus 6x based on my formula. And then I'm going to do my B squared. So 1 squared is just 1. And this is your factor. All right, so you go ahead and try this next one on your own. If you want to pause the video and try it, and then press play when you want to check your answer. All right, go ahead and check your answer. You should have 2x minus 3 times 4x squared plus 6x plus 9. This is how you will factor sum and difference of cubes.